The United States spent 2.5 centuries fighting the native nations of North America, and for a country that would one day call itself the most powerful military on Earth, that is a strange and revealing length of time. If the outcome was never in doubt, if the cavalry and the rifle and the cannon were always going to win, why did it take 10 generations? The answer most people carry is that it was simply slow. A vast continent, a long frontier, a steady advance. But that answer hides something. The wars took so long because the army could not actually win them. On the open field, against warriors who knew the ground and fought brilliantly for it, conventional force failed again and again, at the Little Bighorn, in the swamps of Florida for decades, across plains where humiliation came as often as victory. The nations could not be beaten the way the textbooks imagine, so they were beaten another way. In the winter of 1864, in a red canyon in the southwest, soldiers under a man named Carson did not look for warriors to fight. They looked for trees. They found the peach orchards of the Navajo, thousands of trees that had taken generations to root and bear, and they put them to the axe, every one. They burned the cornfields. They drove off the sheep. And a people who had never been defeated in battle surrendered within months, not to gunfire, but to the certainty of a winter with nothing to eat. This was not cruelty in the heat of war. This was the strategy. It was how the frontier was actually won, not in the battles that fill the paintings, but in the cornfields and the orchards and the slaughtered herds that almost no one remembers. The real weapon of the Indian Wars was hunger, and it was chosen, deliberately, the same way, again and again, for 200 years. To say that the United States won the Indian Wars is to describe an outcome without describing how it was reached. The maps changed. The nations were confined. The land passed into other hands. All of that is true, and all of it conceals the method beneath it. The story that fills the books is a story of soldiers and warriors, of charges and last stands. And that story is not false so much as it is a distraction from the thing that actually decided the war. The thing that decided it was hunger. Consider first what the army could not do. For all its advantages in numbers, in supply, in industry and in artillery, the United States proved remarkably unable to defeat native nations in open battle on ground those nations knew. The pattern repeats across 2.5 centuries with a consistency that should trouble anyone who believes the outcome was simply a matter of force. Again and again, the conventional victory the army sought did not come, and the war went on for another generation. In the summer of 1876, on a ridge above a river in Montana, a column of United States cavalry, under a confident commander, rode into a gathering of Lakota and Cheyenne, and was overwhelmed within an afternoon. It was among the most complete defeats the army suffered in the entire West, and it changed nothing about the eventual outcome. The men who won that day could fight. What they could not do was eat through a winter once the thing that fed them was gone. Far to the southeast, in the swamps of Florida, fewer than 2,000 Seminole warriors held off an army that swelled past 30,000, across a war that ran for 7 years and cost the government 1/10 of its budget. When it ended, there was no surrender and no peace treaty, only a quiet admission that the people in the Everglades could not be reached. The Seminole were never beaten in the field. They were simply written off as not worth the price of chasing. If the nations could not be beaten this way, and yet they were beaten, then the question is not whether they lost, but how. The answer sits in plain sight, in the records of nearly every campaign, written down by the men who carried it out, and yet it has been treated for generations as a footnote to the fighting, rather than the fighting itself. The army learned, early and permanently, that it could not defeat these people, so it set out instead to make sure they could not eat. The method was simple, and its simplicity is part of why it has gone unnamed. Find the thing that keeps a people alive through the year. Find the stored corn, the planted field, the orchard, the fishing weir, the herd, then destroy it, and let the season do the rest. A people can replace warriors faster than they can replace a harvest. Take the harvest, and you do not need to win the battle, because there will be no one left with the strength to fight it. What is striking is how rarely the men who did this called it what it was. The burning of a winter's food was recorded as chastisement, as pacification, as the reduction of a hostile country, as the simple necessity of war. The language was always cooler than the act, and the coolness was not an accident. It is far easier to order the destruction of a people's means of survival when the order speaks of fields and stores, and never of what the absence of them would mean. The method was also passed down. Each campaign that used it became a lesson the next one borrowed. A tactic improvised by desperate colonists in New England in the 1600s became a deliberate order signed by a commanding general within a century, and then a continental practice, and finally something close to industry. It did not appear once and fade. It was inherited, refined at each step, until it had crossed a continent intact. None of this means the battles did not matter. They mattered for the courage they revealed, and the alliances they shifted, and the will they hardened or broke. But they were not what ended the wars, and they were not what decided them. The famous engagements are remembered precisely because they look like a contest between equals, a fair fight with an honest winner. The cornfields are forgotten precisely because they reveal that it was never a fair fight at all. This is the part that must be said plainly, because it changes the meaning of everything that follows. The Hunger War was not a sign of native weakness. It was the opposite. A power turns to starvation only when it has discovered it cannot win any other way, and the United States turned to it again and again. Every burned field is therefore a record of a people who could not be beaten by force, and an admission, written in ash, by the side that could not beat them. What follows is the case, laid out in the order it unfolded. 6 wars, across 6 generations, and the width of a continent. Each one fought a different way on the surface, and won the same way underneath. King Philip's War, where the method was born. Sullivan's march through the towns of the Iroquois, where it became policy. The breaking of the creeks, the burning of the Navajo orchards, the slaughter of the buffalo, the long pursuit of the Apache. 6 witnesses to a single weapon. The pattern is the verdict. The method begins in New England, in the summer of 1675, in a war named for a man the colonists called King Philip. His true name was Metacom, a leader of the Wampanoag, and the war that bears his name would become, for its size, one of the bloodiest ever fought on the soil that became the United States. It is remembered for its raids and its burning towns. It should be remembered for something else. It is the first place where the colonists learned that the surest way to defeat a people was to destroy the food that kept them alive. Even before the first shot, the war was about the means of life. English cattle wandered into Wampanoag cornfields and trampled the crops, and the colonists who owned the cattle answered native complaints with demands for more land. Land was food, and food was survival, and the slow pressure of one people's herds upon another people's fields was already a kind of hunger pressed onto the Wampanoag long before anyone thought to call it war. When the fighting came, it went badly for the colonists. Wampanoag and their allies struck town after town across Plymouth and the Connecticut Valley, burning settlements and vanishing before the militia could close. The English fought in the massed formations they had carried from Europe, and against an enemy who would not stand and meet them, those formations were close to useless. By the autumn of 1675, the colonists were losing, and they knew it. What the colonists could not do was force a battle. The warriors moved through forests the English did not know, struck where they chose, and were gone. But a people at war still has to eat, and the corn that would carry the native coalition through the New England winter could not move the way the warriors could. It was stored. It was heavy. It sat in known places. And a granary, unlike a war party, cannot slip into the trees. So the colonies changed what they were trying to do. They stopped hunting warriors and started hunting stores. Using scouts drawn from rival nations who knew where the food was kept, they set out in the dead of winter to find the granaries and destroy them. The plan rested on a cold piece of arithmetic. A people robbed of its winter food in December has only 2 choices: to starve where it stands, or to come out and fight on the enemy's terms. Either way, the war was won. The clearest expression of the new strategy came in December of 1675, at a place that would be called the Great Swamp Fight. The Narragansett, a nation that had tried to stay out of the war, had gathered in a fortified town on an island deep in a frozen swamp in Rhode Island, and there they had stored the food that would see them through the winter. A colonial force of roughly 1,000 men, guided by native scouts across the frozen ground, marched on it through the snow. The fighting at the fort was brief and costly, and most of the Narragansett warriors escaped into the swamp beyond. But the warriors were never the point. Behind them, the colonists put the town to the torch and burned the winter stores, the corn and the provisions that an entire people had laid up against the cold. The men got away. The food did not. And in a New England December, it was the food, not the men, that the Narragansett could not live without. This is what makes the war the origin of everything that followed. The colonists had discovered that they did not need to defeat a people in battle if they could simply take away the means of surviving the winter, and then let the winter do the rest. The cold became an ally more reliable than any musket. Hunger became a weapon that never missed. The Narragansett warriors had walked away from the fort alive, and into a season that would take more of them than the fighting ever had. Through the winter and into the next year, the strategy did its work. The native coalition, its stored food destroyed, and its people unable to plant or hunt freely under constant pursuit, began to come apart. Starvation, and the sickness that follows it, spread through the camps. Warriors who could not feed their families could not keep fighting. The alliance that had been winning the war in the autumn was, by the following summer, dissolving, not because it had been beaten in the field, but because it could no longer eat. And how was it described, this deliberate destruction of a people's food? In the colonial records, it was simply the conduct of a just war, a necessary chastisement of a savage and rebellious enemy. The burning of the winter stores was set down as a victory and a deliverance, an act of providence on behalf of the godly. No one wrote down that the war had been won by starvation. They wrote that the Lord had delivered the enemy into their hands. The act was real. The name given to it was a comfort. King Philip himself was hunted down in the summer of 1676 and shot near his home at Mount Hope by a native ally of the colonists, and his death is usually given as the end of the war. But Metacom did not lose because he was killed. He was killed because he had already lost, run to ground by a coalition that had collapsed beneath him once its food was gone. The famous ending, the death of the leader, was only the last act of a defeat that hunger had already decided. What the war taught outlasted the war by 2 centuries. The colonists had proven a principle that would never again be forgotten on this continent. An enemy who cannot be beaten in open battle can still be beaten absolutely, by finding and destroying the thing that feeds him and surrendering the rest to the season and to hunger. It was a lesson learned in the snow of New England, and it would be carried west, refined and enlarged, through every war that followed. At its end, the war had killed thousands of native people and shattered the nations of southern New England, reducing a population that had been a quarter of the region to a fraction of that within a decade. But its deepest mark was not the destruction it caused, it was the method it revealed. A century later, the discovery improvised by desperate colonists in the New England winter would be picked up by the new United States and given the full authority of the state. It would be carried into the country of the Iroquois, and this time, it would arrive as an order. 100 years after the snows of King Philip's War, the method the colonists had improvised was taken up by something far larger than a colony. It was taken up by a nation fighting for its own independence, and given the signature of the man who would become its first president. In the summer of 1779, in the middle of the American Revolution, George Washington ordered an army into the homeland of the Iroquois, with instructions that left no doubt about what the war was for. It was for the destruction of a people's food. The Iroquois Confederacy, the 6 allied nations that had held the lands of what is now upstate New York for centuries, had largely sided with the British, and their warriors had struck hard at American settlements along the frontier. Washington's answer was not to defeat them in battle. He had learned, as every commander on this continent eventually learned, that these nations could not reliably be brought to battle at all. So he aimed instead at the one thing that could not run: the towns and the fields and the stored harvest of the Confederacy itself. The orders Washington wrote to General John Sullivan in May of 1779 are among the most revealing documents in the entire history of these wars, because they say plainly what later commanders would only imply. The object of the expedition, Washington wrote, was the total destruction and devastation of the Iroquois settlements. And he was specific about the means. It would be essential, he instructed, to ruin their crops now in the ground, and to prevent their planting more. He went further. The country, he wrote, should not be merely overrun, but destroyed. And he forbade Sullivan from accepting any offer of peace until the ruin of the settlements was complete, because, in Washington's own reasoning, the future security of the United States would rest on the inability of the Iroquois to do it harm. The logic was stated without disguise. A people stripped of its food and its towns could not threaten anyone, and so a people stripped of its food and its towns was the goal. This is the moment that must be understood clearly, because it changes the shape of the whole story. What had happened in New England a century before had been improvised by desperate and disorganized colonists, a tactic stumbled upon in the panic of a losing war. What happened now was different in kind. The same act was being committed deliberately by the regular army of a new republic, on the written order of its commanding general. The method had not grown more savage. It had grown more official. It had become policy. In the late summer of 1779, a force of some 6,000 men marched into the Iroquois country and began to take it apart. They moved methodically from one town to the next, and the Confederacy's warriors, badly outnumbered, did what warriors across this continent had always done against a force they could not meet head-on. They withdrew, and they waited, and they let the army come. There was almost no one to fight. There was only a great deal to burn. The army met real resistance only once, at a place called Newtown, near the present city of Elmira, where a smaller force of Iroquois and their British and Loyalist allies tried to hold a fortified hill and was driven from it. It was the single battle of the entire campaign. After Newtown there were no more battles, because the Iroquois had learned there was no profit in them. From that point on, the expedition was not a war in any ordinary sense. It was a demolition. What the army destroyed in the weeks that followed is recorded in its own reports. 40 towns burned to the ground, 160,000 bushels of corn put to the torch, orchards cut down, and vast stores of beans and squash and gathered fruit destroyed. The soldiers who entered the Iroquois towns wrote with astonishment of what they found: the neat houses, the well-tended fields, the sheer abundance of the harvest standing ripe around them. And then, by order, they burned all of it. There was no exception made for the innocent or the neutral. When the Oneida, a nation that had sided with the Americans, asked Sullivan to spare the towns of their Cayuga kin, he refused, because his orders allowed no such mercy. The destruction was to be total, and total it was. Friend and enemy and bystander among the nations were treated alike, because the target was never really the warriors at all. The target was the food, and the food belonged to everyone. The language used to describe all this is worth pausing on, because here the euphemism was written into the order itself. The deliberate starving of a people was set down as chastisement, as devastation, as the reduction of a hostile country. Later generations of American officers would call it by a cleaner name still. They would call it total war, and they would study this campaign as an early and successful example of it. The act was the destruction of a people's means of life. The phrase that covered it made it sound like strategy. And then, as in New England a century before, the season finished what the army had begun. The winter of 1779 was one of the harshest in memory, burying the Iroquois country under 5 feet of snow, and the people whose stored food had been burned had nothing to carry them through it. Roughly 5,000 of them fled west to the British fort at Niagara, seeking shelter and food, and through that terrible winter many of them did not survive. The campaign itself had killed almost no one in battle. The hunger that followed it killed on a scale no battle had. What this campaign taught was not a new tactic, but a new authority. The destruction of a people's food now carried the full sanction of the state and the signature of its highest commander. It had been done not in panic, but by plan, and it had worked. The Iroquois Confederacy, which had stood for centuries, would never recover the power it lost in that single summer. And the memory ran so deep that to this day the Haudenosaunee call the office of the President of the United States by a name that means, simply, the destroyer of towns. The Hunger War was now an instrument of the United States, proven and recorded and ready to be used again. In the decades that followed, as the young nation turned its hunger toward the South and the lands it wanted there, the method would find a new purpose. It would no longer be only a way to win a war. It would become a way to empty a country before taking it. The destruction of a people's food turned into the opening move of removal. The order given against the Iroquois would echo, a generation later, in the country of the Creeks. In the country that became Alabama, in the years 1813 and 1814, the Hunger War took on a second purpose. Until now, it had been a way to win a war, to break a people who could not be beaten in battle. In the war against the Creeks, it became something more useful still. It became a way to soften a nation for the taking of its land. And the man who learned this lesson most thoroughly was a Tennessee general named Andrew Jackson, who would carry it all the way to the presidency. The Creek War began partly as a war within the Creek Nation itself, between a faction the Americans called the Red Sticks, who resisted the steady loss of their land and their ways, and other Creeks who sought accommodation. It became a wider war when the United States, already fighting the British in the War of 1812, sent its armies into Creek country. Jackson marched south from Tennessee with thousands of militia, and from the start, his method was the one the Iroquois country had seen a generation before. He burned the towns. Through the autumn and winter of 1813, American forces moved through the Creek heartland, destroying settlement after settlement, putting the houses and the gathered harvest to the torch. Town after town went up, their granaries and their winter food with them. The pattern was by now familiar, and it was carried out with the same cold efficiency. The army could not always find the warriors, but it could always find the towns, and the towns could not run. The logic behind this was stated plainly by those who carried it out. Burning the towns forced the Creeks into a choice with no good answer. They could stand and defend their homes and food, and be destroyed in open battle against a stronger force, or they could flee and save their lives, and lose the shelter and the stored harvest that alone could carry them through winter. Either way they would be worn down, in men or in food, until the will to resist was gone. The destruction of the towns was not a means to victory, it was the victory. And as always, the winter did the rest. With the towns burned and the harvest gone, hunger and exposure spread through the Creek country, and the dying was not confined to the warriors. Those who had taken no part in the fighting, driven from their homes into the cold, died in numbers through that winter and the seasons that followed. The army had aimed at the food of a nation, and the food of a nation feeds everyone in it. So everyone in it suffered. The war's decisive battle came in March of 1814, at a bend in the Tallapoosa River, the Creeks called Tococa, and the Americans called Horseshoe Bend, where Jackson, his force strengthened by Cherokee and Creek allies of his own, broke the main body of Red Stick resistance. But the battle only confirmed what hunger had already begun. In the months that followed, the Red Sticks surrendered in growing numbers, many of them driven to it less by defeat in the field than by the destitution that the burning of their country had left behind. And here the second purpose of the Hunger War revealed itself fully. The Creeks had been softened, their towns gone, their harvest gone, their people scattered and starving, and into that ruin the United States now brought not an army, but a document. The fighting had broken the nation's strength. The treaty would take its land. In August of 1814, Jackson summoned the Creek leaders to a fort that bore his name, and there he set before them the price of peace. The price was staggering. By the Treaty of Fort Jackson, the Creek Nation surrendered more than 20 million acres of land, roughly half of everything it held. A vast stretch of what is now Alabama and Georgia, signed away in a single afternoon. It opened a fertile country to American settlement and to the spread of the plantations that would work it. A people that had been made to starve through the winter was now made to sign away its homeland in the summer. What makes the treaty most revealing is who paid. Much of the land taken did not belong to the Red Sticks who had fought the war at all. It belonged to the Creeks who had fought beside Jackson, his own allies, who had bled for the American cause. When they protested that their land was being seized, Jackson told them that the whole Creek Nation must answer for the war, friend and enemy alike. The hunger had broken everyone. The treaty took from everyone. Loyalty bought no exemption. The language of the treaty itself completes the picture. One of its articles records that the Creeks had been reduced to extreme want, and promises that the United States, from motives of humanity, would furnish them the necessities of life until their corn could grow again. The document that took their land thus described, in the same breath, the starvation the war had caused and the charity the victor would extend. It had destroyed a people's food, seized a people's country, and then offered, as mercy, to feed them. This was the template that would shape the next 30 years. Break a people with hunger, then take their land with a treaty, and call the whole of it lawful. And the man who had perfected it did not stop at the Creeks. Andrew Jackson rode this war and others to the presidency of the United States, and from that office, in 1830, he signed into law the act that would remove the southern nations from their homelands altogether and drive them west along the road that history would remember as the Trail of Tears. What the Creek War taught was that hunger and dispossession were two halves of a single machine. The destruction of the food came first and broke the people. The treaty came second and took the land. The removal came last and emptied the country for good. The Creeks who had survived the starvation of 1813 would, a generation later, be marched west from what little remained to them. The method had found its place at the very front of the engine of removal, the first blow in a sequence that ended 1,000 miles away. From the southern forests, the hunger war now moved west, into drier and harder country, and there it would take its purest form yet. In the canyons of the Southwest lived a people who had never been beaten in battle, whose strength rested not on stored corn, but on flocks and on orchards, on peach trees that had taken generations to grow. To break them, the army would not need to win a single fight. It would only need to reach the trees. There is a canyon in the Southwest, in the country that is now northeastern Arizona, whose red sandstone walls rise sheer from a green floor, and whose name in English is rendered Canyon de Chelly. For the Navajo, the people who call themselves the Diné, it was the heart of the world, a place they had tended for centuries. In the winter of 1864, it became the place where the hunger war reached its purest and cruelest form, where the weapon was turned not against stored grain, but against living trees. The Diné were not a people who could easily be starved by a single bad season, because their wealth was spread across many things. They kept great flocks of sheep, they planted corn and squash in the canyon bottoms, and along the floor of Canyon de Chelly and the canyons around it, they had grown, over generations, thousands of peach trees, until the orchards were among the oldest and most cherished things the nation possessed. For more than 2 centuries they had held this country, and no army had ever truly beaten them in it. The man who set out to remove them was a general named James Carleton, who commanded the United States forces in the territory, and who had decided that the Navajo must be gathered up and marched away to a barren reservation far to the east, a place called Bosque Redondo. To carry out this design, he chose a famous frontiersman turned colonel, Christopher Carson, known across the West as Kit. Carson's task was not to win a war, it was to make a people's homeland uninhabitable. And Carson understood the assignment exactly. He did not march into Navajo country looking for battles, because he knew, as every commander before him had known, that these people could vanish into a landscape they understood, and he did not. So he set out instead to destroy everything they needed to live. His soldiers burned the dwellings. They cut down and burned the corn. They drove off and slaughtered the sheep by the thousands. The plan, stated without disguise, was to leave the Navajo a single choice between surrender and starvation. For a long time, the Navajo simply evaded him. They withdrew into the deep canyons and onto the high rock, and they harried his columns from the cliff tops, raining arrows down from ledges no soldier could climb. When Carson finally pushed into Canyon de Chelly itself, his entire sweep killed only a couple dozen Navajo, and a band of 300 held out atop a great sandstone tower called Fortress Rock, lowering vessels on ropes to a stream far below, and survived the whole invasion untouched. In open battle, the army could not beat them, so it stopped trying to. In January of 1864, Carson and his men entered the canyon that the Navajo had believed was their safest refuge, and moved the length of it, some 35 miles between the towering walls. Historians have called this sweep the decisive action of the entire campaign, and yet almost no fighting took place in it. The decisive thing was not a battle, it was what the soldiers did to the canyon floor as they passed through it, to the fields and the flocks, and above all, to the orchards. Carson gave the order that his name would never escape. Every peach tree in Canyon de Chelly was to be cut down. The work was too great to finish in the depth of winter, so his officers returned to it through the months that followed, and across that year they felled and burned the orchards of the canyon, thousands of trees, some of them old enough to have been tended by the grandparents of the people who tended them now. One officer wrote of cutting down in a single day 500 of the finest peach trees he had ever seen, every one of them heavy with fruit, and then they were gone. To understand the cruelty of this, you have to understand what the trees were. A peach tree is not a field that can be replanted in a season. It is the work of years, even decades, a slow inheritance handed from one generation to the next. The orchards of Canyon de Chelly were the living proof that the DNA belonged to that place, that they had rooted themselves in it across centuries. To cut them down was to attack not only the food of a people, but the evidence of their permanence, to tell them that nothing they had built in their own homeland was allowed to last. It worked exactly as intended. With the orchards destroyed, the flocks slaughtered, and the corn burned, the Navajo were left with nothing to carry them through the winter, and the resistance that no battle had broken began to collapse. One historian put it plainly: by laying waste to the canyon, Carson did not defeat the Navajo in war. He broke their ability to live, and so he broke their will. The strongest people in the territory were brought down not by force of arms, but by the certainty of hunger. In the early months of 1864, the Navajo began to come in and surrender, and they came in numbers far greater than anyone had expected. By the spring, some 6,000 of them had gathered at the Army's forts, several thousand more than even Carleton had imagined the campaign would yield. They had held their own against every soldier sent to fight them. But courage could not be eaten, and a winter was coming with nothing to face it, and so they submitted. What followed has its own terrible name in Navajo memory. They call it the Long Walk. Beginning in the spring of 1864, the Army marched the surrendered Navajo east, 300 miles and more across the desert, to the bleak reservation at Bosque Redondo. Carleton's planning provided only 8 days of rations for a journey that took many times that long. Those too weak to keep the pace did not all reach the end of it. A people who had been starved into surrender were now starved again on the road into exile. And the destination was no relief, because the hunger followed them into it. Bosque Redondo was a place that could not feed the thousands penned there. The water was bad, the soil would not yield, the crops failed season after season, and disease moved through the crowded and weakened people. Over the 4 years of their imprisonment, thousands of Navajo died there, of sickness and of want. The weapon that had been turned on their orchards had not finished its work when the trees came down. It pursued them 1,000 miles and went on killing. Carson called what he had done a scorched earth policy, a necessary pacification, and in his report he wrote with satisfaction that the army had shown the Navajo it could reach them anywhere. But the deepest mark this campaign left was on the wider war it fed. Carson's method in the Southwest was studied and admired by a Union general named William Tecumseh Sherman, who would later say it had shaped his own approach, and who in that very same year would carry a strategy he called total war across the American South. The method had crossed from the Indian Wars into the nation's bloodiest conflict, and it would cross back again, into the campaigns to come on the plains. 4 years later, in a rare reversal, the Navajo were allowed to return to a portion of their homeland, and in time, in the canyon, the peaches even grew again. But the method that had broken them did not soften. It was about to be enlarged beyond anything yet seen, carried out of the canyons and onto the open plains, against nations whose entire world, whose food and clothing and shelter and trade, rested upon the body of a single animal. To break them, the army would not burn a field or fell a tree. It would set out to kill, by the millions, the buffalo. On the great grasslands that ran down the center of the continent, there once lived an animal in numbers almost beyond imagining. When the century began, somewhere between 60 and 70 million buffalo moved across the plains in herds so vast that a single one could take days to pass, and the ground itself seemed to shake beneath them. They were the largest gathering of great animals anywhere on Earth, and in the span of a single human lifetime, they would be reduced to a few hundred, on purpose, as an act of war. For the nations of the plains, the buffalo was not merely food. It was the foundation of everything. Its meat fed them, its hide clothed them and roofed their lodges, its bones and sinew became their tools and their bowstrings. Its very existence shaped their movements, their seasons, their trade, and their faith. To be a people of the plains was to live upon the buffalo in every part of life at once. And so to destroy the buffalo was not to take one thing from them, it was to take all things from them in a single stroke. These were not nations that could be beaten in the field. Mounted on horses and ranging across distances no army could control, the peoples of the plains, the Lakota and the Cheyenne, the Comanche and the Kiowa, were among the finest light cavalry in the world. It was on these plains, in 1876, that they destroyed an entire column of American cavalry in an afternoon at the Little Bighorn. The army could lose to them, badly, and did. What it could not do was force them to stand and be conquered. So the same logic that had been used in the New England snow and the Iroquois towns and the Navajo canyons was reached for once again, on a scale to match the plains themselves. The warriors could not be beaten, but the warriors lived on the buffalo, and the buffalo, for all their numbers, could be destroyed. Take away the herds, and there would be no need to win a battle, because a people cannot remain free, or even alive, on an empty plain. The commissary of the Plains nations walked on 4 legs, and it could be killed. The men who understood this most clearly had learned it in the nation's own Great War. William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan, the generals who had carried total war across the American South, now turned the same thinking toward the plains. Sherman held that the only way to force these peoples onto reservations and make farmers of them was to clear the prairies of the buffalo entirely. The method that had been studied in the Navajo campaign had passed through the Civil War and come back transformed, and it was now to be aimed at an entire species. What made it possible was the machine of an industrializing nation. The railroads pushed west across the plains and gave the hunters a way to carry millions of hides to the factories of the east, where buffalo leather had become a prized and profitable thing. Armed with powerful new rifles that could kill at great range, organized bands of hide hunters spread across the grasslands in moving waves, and a single skilled shooter could bring down 100 or more animals in a day. The killing was no longer the work of individuals, it was an industry. It is tempting to see in this only greed, and greed was certainly there, in abundance. But the slaughter was something more than a business, because the government and the army watched it spread across the plains, and recognized in it a weapon they could not have built themselves. The hide hunters chased their profit. The state, looking on, saw a way to starve a dozen nations into submission without firing a shot. Commerce and conquest moved together, each serving the other, and the line between them all but disappeared. And the state did not merely look on in silence. In 1872, the Secretary of the Interior set down the policy in an official report, in words no one could mistake. The vanishing of the buffalo from the hunting grounds, he wrote, would work strongly in favor of the government's effort to confine the Indians to smaller areas and compel them to abandon their wandering life. Here a cabinet officer of the United States was stating plainly, in a public document, that the destruction of the herds served the nation's purposes. The hunger war had been written into the record of government itself. This was not idle approval. The government gave material aid to the slaughter, handing out free ammunition to any buffalo hunter who asked for it, so that the killing would never want for bullets. The sentiment behind the policy was put most bluntly by an army colonel, who declared that every dead buffalo meant one less of the people who lived on it. Every buffalo dead, he said, is an Indian gone. There was no euphemism left in that. It was the strategy of the whole war, spoken in a single line. Here is what set the war on the buffalo apart from every form the hunger war had taken before. It did not look like war at all. There were no burning towns, no soldiers putting orchards to the axe, nothing that an observer could point to and name as an act of cruelty. There was only commerce, the lawful pursuit of profit by private men, and sport, and the seemingly natural retreat of the wild before the advance of civilization. The destruction of a dozen nations' food was carried out in the open, in plain daylight, dressed as the ordinary business of a growing country. The killing moved across the plains in a methodical tide. First, the great central herds were destroyed in the early years of the 1870s. Then the slaughter swept south, across the ranges of the Comanche and the Kiowa, through the middle and later years of the decade. And finally, in the early 1880s, it reached the northern plains, the last stronghold of the buffalo and of the Lakota who depended on them. And there the herds were brought to their end. Region by region, the foundation of plains life was pulled away. The effect on the nations was immediate and devastating. On the southern plains, as the herds collapsed, the Comanche and their Kiowa allies, watching their world destroyed before their eyes, struck back at a camp of the hide hunters who were emptying their country. That blow brought down upon them a full military campaign, the Red River War, which drove the southern nations from the open plains for good. The destruction of the buffalo did not merely starve these peoples, it provoked the very wars that finished them. And then, with a suddenness that stunned even the men who had brought it about, the buffalo were simply gone. The plains that had thundered for 10,000 years fell silent. The herds that had numbered in the tens of millions were reduced, within a few short years, to a remnant of a few hundred animals scattered across the remote corners of the land. And the nations that had lived upon them, the proud and mounted and undefeated peoples of the plains, were left with a single, brutal choice. They could come to the reservations and be fed, or they could remain free on an empty grassland and starve. This is the heart of the matter, and it must be said without flinching. The buffalo were never the true target. They were killed in their millions, not for any quarrel anyone had with them, but because of the people whose lives depended on them. The war on the herd was the war on the nations of the plains, carried out against an animal so that it would not have to be carried out, openly and namelessly, against human beings. To destroy the buffalo was to destroy a people, at one remove, in a way that let the destroyers tell themselves they were only hunting. In this the hunger war reached its final and most perfect form. A people could now be defeated without ever being met, without a battle, without even an army, simply by destroying at industrial scale the thing they lived upon, through the workings of the market, with the blessing of the state, and the bullets of the state to do it. It was the most total expression of the method this continent had yet seen, and it was the one that looked least like what it was, the one most easily mistaken, then and now, for the mere unfolding of progress. With the buffalo gone, the Great Plains emptied of free people, and the reservations filled. But far to the southwest, in a country of desert and mountain too harsh to hold herds or orchards, one people still remained beyond the reach of every form the hunger war had taken. They lived on almost nothing, moved like the wind across ground no army could master, and could not be starved by burning a field or killing a herd, because they depended on neither. To break them, the method would have to change one last time. It would no longer destroy a people's food. It would deny them the chance to ever stop and find any. In the deserts and mountains of the Southwest, along the broken border between the United States and Mexico, lived the last free people the hunger war had not been able to reach. The Apache could not be starved the way the others had been, because they kept no granaries to burn, no orchards to fell, no herds to slaughter. They carried their world with them and lived on what the harshest land could give. And so, against them, the method took its final and strangest form, in the long pursuit of a man the Mexicans had named Geronimo. The Apache were, by common agreement of the soldiers who chased them, among the most formidable irregular fighters the world had ever produced. They knew every spring and canyon of a vast and waterless country, and they could cross it faster and on less than any army that came after them. A small band could travel 60 miles or more in a day, across ground that broke the soldiers who followed. They struck without warning and vanished without trace. No column could corner them, and no force could bring them to a battle they did not choose. This was a people the older forms of the hunger war could not touch. There were no winter stores to find, because they stored almost nothing. There were no fields to burn, because they planted little, and no orchards, and no flocks driven before them across the desert. A people who lived on what they could carry, and what the land provided, could not be starved by the destruction of their food, for they kept no food to destroy. The torch that had broken the Wampanoag and the Navajo had nothing here to burn. So when Geronimo and his followers fled the reservation for the last time, in the spring of 1885, the United States answered with one of the most lopsided campaigns in the history of warfare. Against Geronimo's band, which never numbered more than a few dozen people, most of them women and children, with perhaps 24 fighting men among them, the army eventually sent 5,000 soldiers, a full quarter of its entire strength, along with hundreds of scouts, and hundreds of Mexican troops besides. Never had so vast a force been turned against so few. Rather than try to defeat the Apache, the army settled on a different weapon altogether. It would simply refuse to ever stop chasing them. Geronimo could outrun any single column of soldiers, but the army would deny him the one thing his survival truly depended on, which was the chance to stop, the chance to rest, to sleep, to hunt, to gather food and water in safety. The pursuit itself, endless and inescapable, became the weapon. The general who perfected this, Nelson Miles, turned the whole territory into a trap. He spread his 5,000 men in small detachments across the land, so that there was scarcely a waterhole or a ranch in all of Arizona and New Mexico without soldiers within easy reach of it. And he built a chain of mirror stations on the high ground, flashing signals from peak to peak, so that the moment the Apache were sighted anywhere, the word raced across the country faster than any horse. The Apache could live off the land only if they could pause to do it, and now they could never pause. And so the band ran, for 16 months and across more than 1,600 miles, never resting, always pursued. The soldiers who followed were slow under their heavy loads, and the Apache were swift, but the soldiers were many and could be relieved when they tired, while the Apache were few and could not. Day after day, with no time to hunt or sleep or simply stop, the small band was worn steadily down. They were not defeated in any fight. They were ground to exhaustion by a chase that never ended, until going on became impossible. And as in so many of these wars, the army could not have done it alone. It was Apache scouts, men of the same people, who guided the soldiers into the hidden strongholds deep in the Mexican Sierras, where Geronimo's band had always believed itself safe from any pursuit. When the soldiers appeared in those innermost places, the Apache were astonished, because they understood at once that only their own kin could have led the enemy there. The pursuit that wore Geronimo down was made possible by the very people it was meant to break. Yet even with 5,000 soldiers and every advantage of numbers and technology, the army never once cornered Geronimo's band or beat it in battle. The Apache raided where they pleased and slipped away untouched, time and again. And Miles, for all the vast resources he had poured into the hunt, had in the end nothing to show for it. He was forced at last to negotiate with Geronimo rather than defeat him, because the band, exhausted as it was, still could not be caught. They remained, to the very end, unconquered in the field. In the end, what finished it was despair. Worn past endurance by the endless chase, Geronimo was brought word that there was no longer anything to go back to. His entire people, the peaceful Chiricahua who had stayed quietly on the reservation, had been seized and shipped to distant prisons in Florida. There was no home left to return to, and no people left to protect. A man can keep running while there is something to run toward. When that was taken away, the will to go on went with it. In September of 1886, at a place in Arizona called Skeleton Canyon, Geronimo handed his rifle to General Miles and surrendered for the last time. With that act, the longest resistance in the history of these wars came to an end, with the surrender of a few exhausted people who could no longer find a place to rest. Years later, Geronimo would explain it simply. "There is no sense," he said, "in fighting on when there is no longer any hope of winning." He had not been beaten. He had been left no way to continue. And then came the act that revealed the whole campaign for what it was. The army did not only exile Geronimo and the warriors who had fought. It rounded up and sent to Florida every Chiricahua it could find, the peaceful and the warlike alike. And among them, the Apache scouts themselves, the very men whose tracking had made the victory possible. Those who had served the army loyally were imprisoned beside those they had helped to capture. Loyalty once again bought no exemption. The target had never been Geronimo. It had been a people, and the people were taken whole. With Geronimo's surrender, the last free native nation passed under the control of the United States, and the Indian Wars, after 2.5 centuries, were effectively over. The method that had begun in the snows of New England with a burned granary had ended in the deserts of the Southwest, with a people denied the chance to stop and eat. It had worn 100 different faces, the torch and the axe, the slaughtered herd and the endless chase. But underneath them all it had been one weapon, used again and again. The time has come to look at it whole. in a single afternoon, and the long silence that followed across the empty land was given, by those who had made it, the name of peace.